He's the best kept secret in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
He's really selfless. He literally doesn't ask us for anything. No money, no nothing. He just wants you to show up to training. And I think he gets a lot of satisfaction from building athletes and seeing them succeed with the stuff that he teaches.
Who is the grappling mastermind behind one of MMA's greatest champions? How did Gordon Ryan become the most dominant grappler in Jiu-Jitsu? The answer is John Danaher. But how did a philosophy teacher and self-proclaimed cripple from New Zealand end up being the world's most famous jiu-jitsu coach? Welcome to Resenha BJJ and another episode of BJJ Legacies. This time we're exploring the history of the most famous and maybe the greatest ever BJJ coach. That's right, we're going to take a look at who John Danaher is and where he came from. And if you're looking to level up your jiu-jitsu Rashguards and gis, make sure to check out phalanxfc.com and use discount code Resenha to get a sweet deal at checkout. John Danaher was born in 1967 in Washington, D.C. His parents, originally from New Zealand, were only temporarily in the USA and soon returned to New Zealand. Danaher would spend his childhood in New Zealand where he would train different striking martial arts such as boxing and Muay Thai as he grew up. And according to Gordon Ryan, he also hunted pigs in his spare time.
I'm like, John, like, what was your favorite, TV show growing up? He goes, we didn't have TV, we hunted hogs. And I'm like, okay, and he just tell me about that.
Unfortunately, when he was a teenager, he suffered a terrible leg injury in a rugby incident that would affect him for the rest of his life. When he got older, Danaher proceeded to study and teach philosophy at the University of Auckland. In 1991, Danaher moved to New York to start his PhD at Columbia University under a full-ride scholarship. But he blew his scholarship money quickly and needed to get a job to make ends meet. One day, while walking in New York City, he ended up defending a man who was being attacked. So grateful and impressed was the man, he offered Danaher a job bouncing at his nightclub. Thus began Danaher's career as a bouncer. So while at Columbia, Danaher worked nights as a bouncer and then studied and taught philosophy during the day.
When I first came to America working as a bouncer, I started working with wrestlers and judo players. And I noticed very quickly that they were extremely effective in fighting. And this was a big shock to me. I was like, man, these guys are good.
As a nightclub bouncer, Danaher worked with colleagues from all sorts of martial arts backgrounds, such as judo and wrestling. He saw how effective these bouncers were at controlling rowdy partygoers without having to strike them. With punches and kicks involved, scenes would get bloody fast, and even the striker was at risk of hurting their hands after an altercation. But these weren't issues for the bouncers who used grappling. Then by chance, one of Danaher's colleagues at Columbia started taking jiu-jitsu classes.
He said, John, I know you work at night as a bouncer. He's like, I've started doing this martial art. It's called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a grappling style. And I was like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, Jiu-Jitsu is Japanese. Like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
And one day in the office, he showed Danaher some of the moves he had been learning. Danaher was astounded by how a much smaller man with very limited knowledge was able to outmaneuver him on the ground. He had grown up in a time when grappling wasn't considered manly, dignified, or even useful in a fight. As a kid, he believed the strikers were the greatest fighters in the world. His colleague's demonstration was then reinforced when Danaher watched the early UFC tapes of Royce Gracie defeating his larger opponents. Danaher immediately decided he needed to get at least some degree of competency in this art. He enrolled at Renzo Gracie's Academy in New York and proceeded to study Jiu-Jitsu in 1995. He saw the benefits soon after as his job as a bouncer became a lot easier with the use of pins and strangleholds. While he enjoyed Jiu-Jitsu, he still wasn't hooked. At least not yet.
Jump. I say, really? What do you do? He goes, philosophy. Okay.
Around the late 90s, Renzo Gracie approached Danaher about helping him write a book about Jiu-Jitsu, and in turn, he offered to mentor Danaher closely. Danaher jumped at the opportunity. He would race from university classes to train at Renzo's and then go to his job as a bouncer, where he would be writing in the dark between dealing with fights. Danaher not only got to train with Renzo Gracie, but he also got to call Matt Serra, Ricardo Almeida, Sean Williams, and Rodrigo Gracie his teammates.
Wait a minute.
Longo's the only one?
Wait a minute.
Look at the fucking power of this thing. It's pretty.
For some reason, it just doesn't look funny. Maybe because he's like looks like a superhero. That's like his superhero patch. He's like Batman. That's like his utility belt.
Danaher and Renzo would end up publishing 2 books together. First, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Theory and Technique, which Royce Gracie also co-authored, which
which is a great overall guide for anyone learning Jiu-Jitsu who also has aspirations to one day teach. And then Mastering Jiu-Jitsu, which is a great book on how Jiu-Jitsu integrates with MMA, which is particularly insightful given both Renzo's and Danaher's involvement in MMA. But more on that later. Soon after, Renzo asked purple belt John Danaher to start teaching. Renzo was busy with traveling with his MMA career, and the more senior students such as Matt Serra and Ricardo Almeida were leaving to start their own gyms. This left Danaher as Renzo's best qualified student to start teaching, which overwhelmed him at first. He felt a responsibility to improve his jiu-jitsu so that the school would continue to grow and improve without its former top students. This is when Danaher truly got hooked on jiu-jitsu, but it left him at a crossroads as he was just about to finish his PhD. He had to choose between a PhD and an academic life as a professor working in universities, or staying at Renzo's and teaching jiu-jitsu. He ended up choosing jiu-jitsu, obviously, and in April of 2002, he was awarded his black belt from Renzo Gracie. One interesting thing to note about Danaher's time with Renzo is that he refused payment for teaching classes. He felt it was wrong to take money from his sensei. So how did he manage to pay his bills in one of the most expensive cities in the world? He taught private lessons all day, and that is where he made his living. Between teaching classes and private lessons, it was not unusual for Danaher to spend 10 or more hours a day in the gym. John Danaher became so well known for his instruction and his private lessons, it actually led to his acting debut in the show Billions in 2017.
You've got to learn the difference between naive aggression and effective aggression.
For 4 episodes, John Danaher got to teach Paul Giamatti the ways of turning defense into offense at Renzo Gracie Brooklyn. Apparently, one of the show's writers trained at Renzo's and was inspired to write jiu-jitsu into the story. Having suffered a traumatic injury in his youth that resulted in surgeries throughout his life, Danaher's full effort sparring days were limited. And in fact, he never once competed in jiu-jitsu. Competition in either MMA or jiu-jitsu was never on the cards for him. But that didn't mean he still couldn't forge a path in the martial arts. Rather than focusing so much on training at 100% effort, he instead mastered the art of coaching. Danaher would go on to perfect his jiu-jitsu skills and develop a teaching system, or pedagogy, that would create jiu-jitsu and MMA champions in minimal amounts of time.
If you want to see more content like this, then make sure to support the channel by going to ourjujitsu.com and grabbing some jiu-jitsu inspired t-shirts and hoodies. Back to the video.
One of his most successful students was UFC champion George St. Pierre. Danaher was a jiu-jitsu coach for one of MMA's greatest champions of all time. Their relationship started when GSP began traveling to New York from Montreal to train at Renzo Gracie's. Danaher started working with GSP before he was in the UFC, when he was just starting out on the amateur circuit, and he was an integral part of GSP's team throughout his whole career.
What George is trying to tell you is this could be the best experience of your life or the worst.
Exactly.
We have no clue which one is gonna be.
Now you may be wondering, but isn't Danaher just a jiu-jitsu coach? Actually, he loves MMA, maybe more so than jiu-jitsu itself, as he sees it as the best test of true hand-to-hand combat.
People who know John on a personal level and have trained with John know that John knows just as much about MMA as he does, or even more about MMA than he does about jiu-jitsu. He's been coaching MMA with George and with Chris Weidman for longer than he's been coaching jiu-jitsu. I mean, he's only been coaching professional jiu-jitsu athletes for 5 years.
Remember, Danaher grew up practicing striking arts. He then spent several years as a bouncer where he tested and refined his skills in the field. Grappling came to Danaher much later in life. He was already 28 by the time he started jiu-jitsu. Danaher's life experience, his jiu-jitsu skills, his teaching ability, and of course the records of his students make him one of the most sought-out MMA coaches in the world. He himself says he would love to one day share his MMA-specific systems and instructionals, but for now is focusing more on jiu-jitsu.
He's the best kept secret in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I'm not, and ask anybody, but people talk about him on the message boards and John Danaher, who's that? Is that the guy that looks like Robin Williams? Yes, he might be true. He might look a little like Robin Williams. And believe it or not,
Which Robin Williams? Was it more commitment or was it that weight on the serial?
definitely the serial killer one.
Danaher's growing reputation as a coach did more than just attract MMA prodigies. He also attracted talented athletes from the jiu-jitsu community. Two such students were Eddie Cummings and Gary Tonin. Eddie Cummings began training with John Danaher in the early 2010s as a blue belt. Eddie's particular interest in leg locks led to him developing a close relationship with Danaher, and the two are credited with bringing the modern leg lock game to mainstream jiu-jitsu. Gary was already an accomplished semi-pro jiu-jitsu athlete at the brown and purple belt levels when he began training with Danaher, also in the early 2010s. Under the tutelage of Danaher, Gary's and Eddie's jiu-jitsu careers hit new levels by winning a number of Eddie Bravo Invitational titles, or EBI titles, and super fights with a leg lock style that attracted the attention of the jiu-jitsu world. Following the success of Gary was a young high schooler named Gordon Ryan that began commuting with Gary to train with Danaher. Tagging behind Gordon was his little brother, Nicky Ryan. With Danaher's teaching and this group of young talented grapplers, Danaher's small team within the Renzo Gracie Manhattan School would change grappling history. So tight-knit was this group and so dominant were their performances, other students at Renzo's began calling them DDS, which stands for Danaher Death Squad. Danaher himself wasn't the biggest fan of this nickname, and instead just referred to the group as the Squad. Gary Tonin would go on to amaze fans with exciting and acrobatic performances in EBI and ADCC competition. In 2018, Gary began competing in MMA with John Danaher as his main grappling and striking coach. Gary has had an impressive run in ONE FC with various wins coming from submissions and knockouts. Within a couple years of training at Renzo Gracie with Danaher, Gary, and Gordon, Nicky Ryan became a teen prodigy and the youngest ever athlete at the age of 16 to compete at an ADCC World Championship. It was not unusual to see teen Nicky Ryan submitting black belts many years older than him. Then there's Danaher's most famous student and the most dominant no-gi grappler currently, Gordon Ryan. Gordon selflessly attributes all of his success as both an athlete and an instructor to John Danaher. He has often referred to Danaher as a kind of cheat code, an encyclopedia of combat sport knowledge, who is completely dedicated to his students and craft as a teacher.
It's like literally like a cheat book. Like you ask John a question about anything, you ask him about a striking question, you ask him about a grappling question, doesn't matter. You ask him about a frisbee question, and he knows the answer.
Unfortunately, in 2018, Danaher announced that one of his star pupils, Eddie Cummings, had left the squad. Danaher posted to Instagram explaining that Eddie wasn't comfortable training with teammates who could potentially be his opponents. To this day, Eddie's competitive performances under John Danaher have been studied by fans all over the world and have influenced the styles of many famous grapplers.
Okay guys, I'm here with my friend Bernardo Fari, a huge honor for me. Good to see you, Bernardo.
However, it was not all bad news in 2018. A few months later, Danaher released his first BJJ Fanatics instructional, Leg Locks Enter the System. This was the instructional that everyone in the community had been dreaming of. It was well known that Danaher and his squad like to keep their strategies and approaches inside the walls of Renzo's. And it came as a surprise when it was announced Danaher would be releasing an instructional, especially one on the tactics that led to his students winning at the highest levels. So great was the demand and so bad was the audio of the original instructional that BJJ Fanatics refilmed and re-released Danaher's leg lock instructional only a couple months later. This was the start of a new era for BJJ Fanatics and Danaher. No longer constrained by time or geography, Danaher now had the ability to reach the world of Jiu-Jitsu and make a substantial amount of money that didn't require his time or presence, the way teaching classes in privates did. Of course, he still did those things, but he wasn't dependent on them to make a living. The success of Danaher's instructionals provided a boom for the industry and also led to the students of DDS releasing their own instructionals. 2019 marked one of the most successful ADCC runs of Danaher's squad to date. Gordon Ryan took home both the under 99 kilo division gold and the absolute gold. Gary Tonin won bronze in the 77 kilo division. DDS part-timer Nick Rodriguez, aka Nicky Rod, who was a blue belt at the time, took home silver in the over 99 kilo division. Following ADCC 2019, Nicky Rod joined Danaher's team full-time, and the 88 kilo silver medalist, Craig Jones, joined the team following the tournament. The dream team was assembled. 2020 generated many changes for John Danaher and his group of students. New York City entered a strict lockdown and the Blue Basement was temporarily shut down. Danaher was no longer teaching his regular classes in privates. Now, if anyone wanted to train Jiu-Jitsu, they would have to meet in secrecy. Obviously, this included DDS, and the squad of professionals was no longer able to train as they had before the quarantine restrictions. The members of the squad became very unhappy with life in New York and no longer felt they could continue progressing their careers in the state. Unlike his students, Danaher loved living in New York, which had been his home for 30 years. However, he also recognized that the squad of professionals he had spent many years teaching were going to leave New York, with or without him. With this dilemma in mind, Danaher decided he would follow his students when they chose to leave.
I personally love New York.
Yes.
But every single person in the squad despised New York and wanted to leave for a long time.
In 2021, under the advice of his senior students, Danaher and DDS moved to Puerto Rico, where the team could train in peace, free from restrictions. Puerto Rico was not his first choice. Danaher had instead suggested the team go to Texas, but he conceded to the opinions of his students that the island was the place to be. Unfortunately, the island paradise was not so perfect, and soon tensions arose amongst the team members. With ADCC 2022 on the horizon, Danaher did his best to convince the squad to hold it together for one more year, but his attempts were futile. The Danaher death squad split in two. Notably, Craig Jones, Nicky Rod, and Nicky Ryan left to form their own team in Austin, Texas, called the B Team. Danaher and his students Gordon Ryan and Gary Tonin then formed their own team called New Wave Jiu Jitsu, and they also moved to Austin, Texas, the state that Danaher had originally suggested before leaving New York. For John Danaher, this was a low point. He had 1 year until ADCC 2022, and 75% of his students had left to form a rival team. His star pupil, Gordon Ryan, was also undergoing several medical issues that made it very difficult for him to train. Danaher also had no physical gym to call home in Austin. Prior to the team breakup, the plan was for the whole squad to train at the location that B Team currently occupies. Gymless and missing many of his best students, Danaher was not in a great moment of his coaching career.
That was a time when it was like, man, the whole program seems to be dead in the water at this point. Most of the competitive athletes were gone. There were very few training partners for the few that remained, and the main athlete around whom the group had initially bonded was seemingly out of action, possibly permanently.
However, he remained patient and confident in his coaching abilities. In Austin, Danaher began teaching some classes at the local Renzo Gracie affiliate. New Wave also began using the mat space at a private gym for eyewear company Roca. At this time, one of Danaher's ukes from his BJJ instructionals, Giancarlo Bodoni, decided to move to Austin and train with Danaher full-time. Then, because Danaher's classes at Renzo Gracie Austin were open to public, students from all over the world came to visit and train with him. One such student was South African Luke Griffith, who showed so much potential that Danaher invited him to the private New Wave training at Roca. Following a meeting with Gordon Ryan, the gi phenom Nicholas Marigali decided to visit Austin and try his hand at no-gi. So impressed was Marigali with Danaher's teaching, the Brazilian decided to join New Wave full-time. And as they say, the rest is history. Within months of ADCC 2022, Danaher went from having lost some of his most promising students to building a new team made up of purple belts and former gi students that went on to become one of the top teams at ADCC 2022. The younger students, Luke Griffith and Dan Manasu, secured invites by winning ADCC trials. Giancarlo Bodoni became the ADCC 88 kilo champion against all odds. Nicholas Marigali, who had never tried no-gi until months prior to ADCC, took home a silver and bronze medal. Gordon Ryan, of course, overcame his illness and dominated the over 99 kilo division, and won the ADCC super fight against Andre Galvao, a feat that has never been accomplished before. Every one of these students credit their success in such a short period of time to John Danaher. As a recording of this video, Danaher continues to teach public classes at Renzo Gracie Austin and his private New Wave classes at Roca. Danaher also is regularly releasing new instructionals through BJJ Fanatics.
Now I want to ask you, what did you learn about John Danaher, and how do you think he will be remembered in Jiu-Jitsu history? Tell us in the comments. As always, check out ourjujitsu.com for Jiu-Jitsu streetwear, leave a like, subscribe, and see you in the next one.